Welcome, welcome, welcome. My name is Kirill, and today we're going to be looking at an episode on how we can use buttons in Creatio. Unfortunately, the previously announced ALM section is still unavailable because of some personal issues that we're dealing with people, succumbing to COVID. So as of today, I'm going to be trying to run this episode by myself. So again, my name is Kirill. I'm a trainer with the Academy. Been doing it for quite some time. And today's session will be the one that I planned on doing a couple of weeks from now. And we're going to talk about buttons. Buttons that we can add in Creatio, buttons that we can add in sections, and things that surround our buttons, the challenges, the difficulties that we might experience as we're trying to program some of the UIs. Okay, so first of all, why do we need buttons? Well, it's quite obvious. We use buttons to trigger actions, to start any operation, to execute any methods, be it user interface methods or be it a method implemented somewhere in the backend. It really doesn't matter. We need some sort of a trigger to start our action. Now, Creatio offers us quite a lot of features already that perhaps we can get away without using buttons. For example, things such as attributes. We can bind items so that when the values are changing, we can automatically execute various things. But nonetheless, there's nothing more obvious for the user, nothing better for the user than seeing some sort of a custom button that he or she wants to click, press, and get some sort of a reaction. So what we're going to be looking at today is essentially how we can program our buttons, how we can program our actions, and how we can create menus, submenus, and maybe decorate some items with pictures. So in order for us to start off, I'd like to start off by showing you what I have prepared for us, and then we're going to go and review the code that I intend on publishing on GitHub. Now, the project will be published on GitHub. The links will be available in the description below, but for now, it has not yet been published online, so please don't try looking. And today, probably towards the end of the day, I will have it published. Okay, so let's review a couple of items that I have added for us. So the first thing that you will see is that there is an obvious button here. So it's called section ABC. The reason I called ABC is it will become apparent why it's ABC in just a couple of minutes when we're looking at the code and how we're adding it. But nonetheless, all you have to know is that there is a button here, and we can click on it, and some actions are going to be performed. The actions that we're going to be performing today are going to be quite simple. We're going to be showing a dialog with the name of the button that it's clicked. We are not going to be implementing any useful methods. So we're not going to be doing actual work. We're just going to be putting a button, providing a handler that you can put your own logic in. All right, so this is my section button. Let's go inside the contact. And once I go inside the contact, you will be greeted also by a number of buttons here. You will see that there is a section button here, a red button. There is the same green button that we saw before. And when we open the section or when we expand the section, you'll see that the green button will jump here. And the reason I color-coded them as red and as green is quite obvious. It's just so they stand out. Okay, so they stand out, and colors are very easy for us to track. Now, once we go onto the page or onto the page in the contact, you'll see that there is also another button here. This particular button offers us a submenu item. So I'll show you how we can add a menu and inside any button, how we can discern which button is actually clicked, be it a big red button or a little submenu. So that's going to option number one. I will tell you about combined mode and a page mode. So in this case, we are now in what's called a combined mode. And if we just simply navigate to the link, or we're trying to create a new record in Creatio, so I'm just refreshing my site to navigate directly, you'll see that there's a different collection of buttons here. And in the same way, the buttons can be added with the submenu items. And I'm demonstrating a couple of different designs or a couple of different formats for how you may want to decorate your buttons. So some are green, some are blue, some are gray or transparent. and some could be red, and all of them could contain submenu items. The next thing that I would like to show you today is how we can work with these actions. So these actions are very convenient. As you could see, the buttons, the more buttons I add, if I add 5 or 6 more buttons, I'm probably going to run out of space. And if my monitor is small, and if I were just to shrink it like this, it's really becoming really unattractive. So having a lot of buttons on the screen in the top section, as desirable as it may be from the convenience standpoint, once your monitor gets busy with all these buttons, it's going to be quite difficult and quite distracting for your user to to actually use your buttons. So to solve these problems, designers of the product have figured that there could be an action button, and this action button, just like this button, has a bunch of submenu items, and we can put items inside here. I've created a couple of items to demonstrate what you can do. So for example, you've got a page action item and page action item 2. One such item I've decorated with an image or logo of Creatio, one of the logos of artwork of Creatio. So I put it here. And also on the section, if we go inside the section, I've created a few more items here. And in this example, I'm showing how you can create one item and inside this item put sub-items of yourself. So you can mimic the behavior that is happening here in a standard Creatio product. So you've got an item, and inside the item you can have sub-item, and inside this item you can have sub-item, and you can go down this rabbit hole for quite some time. So if you need to create this rich menu and you need to decorate it with pictures or items just like these ones, then I provided you with all the examples that you need in order for you to program it. So the first thing that I want to talk to you about is the simplest of them all, and that's going to be this red button. Now, I've already written the code, so I'm not going to be turning anything off. So we're going to be just looking now at the components that are relevant for this particular button. Let me just hide things that I don't want you to see just yet, and we're going to start looking at my red button. Now, in order to program this red button, I'm going to be using external editor, Visual Studio Code, just because I find it a little bit easier to navigate around than using our built-in designer. All right, let me bring it up on the screen, and let's take a look at what I'm working with. So what I'm working with here is essentially contact page v2. So we're sitting inside of our how to buttons package, and that's just a regular package that we create with the standard tools. In my case, I've created it with the help of Clio. I thought maybe I'm going to implement some services, but it turns out that I didn't. So it's just a regular contact page v2, a replacing client schema, and the way you get it, and the easiest way to get a replacing client schema without making any mistakes whatsoever, is to come back to your browser and just simply click on View, Open Section Wizard, and Open Page, Close Page, and it will create replacing client schemas inside your package. The result of this work, if you go inside of your package, you will see that you will have how to buttons package, and in here you'll have contact page v2 and contact section v2. Both of these files will be used to add buttons and to add action menus just so that they show up in the right place. All right, let's now take a look at this contact page v2. So my system is in development and file system mode. So when I come here, or if I look at the file content in Visual Studio, it's exactly the same file. It's exactly the same content. There is no difference. It just, I find it a little bit easier in Visual Studio to navigate. Perfect. Let's move on. So the way we add button, and the way we add button onto here is in exactly the same way that you would add any other component, be it a text box or a checkbox, or maybe a link. It's adding it in exactly the same way. So let's take a look how we're adding this and in which way we can actually add it. So we're starting off by defining our our element, and I believe, yes, this is a red button. And we're starting off by saying that we're performing operation insert. We now have to specify a parent name, and in our case, the parent happens to be a contact general info block that is responsible for this whole thing, right? So this whole thing is called general info block. That's just the layout of our page. Okay. The next thing that I'm specifying here is that I would like to put it inside the array called items, and the name of my element is going to be my button. If you've done any UI work on our system, this should be familiar to you. There should be nothing new. In fact, wizards, when you go with the help of low code and you use this code with the help of wizard, most of this code will be generated for you. Now, inside values, we can specify a layout, just like any other element. And in here, I am specifying that I would like to position my button, or in this case, my element that I called my red button, in a row 3 in reference to contact general blocks. Inside the contact block, you have a grid of rows and columns. So we're going into row 3, and we're putting into column 13. There's a total of 24 columns. So this is dead center, right in the middle. I'm also specifying a column span. I can specify row span, but the reason I'm doing it is just to show that this setting is completely irrelevant. It is not respected for the buttons, and buttons have their own sizing mechanism, and they do not respect col span or row span. So just bear that in mind. Now that I've specified the layout and I told the system to put my new element here, and it doesn't have to be a button, can be anything else. Now I want to actually go and configure my button in such a way that it says red button, that it's got a color red, and the system actually knows that it's the button. And then obviously I want to go and add some sub-items to it. Okay, so I tell the system that this is a button by specifying a property called item type. So let me just minimize this layout. So things are a little bit more obvious. We're specifying that it's the button, and we can also specify the style. Now, when the item type is a required field in order for you to generate a button, then the style is not. If you omit the style, then the button is going to be just a default style, and it's going to be a transparent button with a blue text on it. It's fairly difficult to see on white page if you don't know that it's there, but nonetheless, you can still omit this line. So line 63 is completely optional. The next thing is I'm providing a couple of properties in reference to the behavior. So here I'm saying, okay, well, my button will call a method called onMyButtonClick. So this is what's going to happen when you click on the button. The button is going to have a caption that is defined in my localizable string, so I can provide multiple values for my button. And you can find this localizable string only if you go inside Creatio. So inside the configuration screen, you go on the contact page v2, you open the client schema, and you find this localizable string in here. So if you look at my localizable string, I believe I called it there you go, my red button caption. Okay, so here's my red button caption, and the text is going to be here. So if you click on the pencil, you will see the text there. The same thing I've created for my red button hint. So I've created a localizable string, and this allows me to provide values in multiple languages. If you choose, let's say, your language to be Spanish or French, and it's not English, then the values in your respective languages will appear for this button if you provide those localizable strings in this configuration here. Let's go back to our caption. Let's take a look at the hint now. A hint is an easy way for you to advise a user or give user more guidance as to what to expect when the button is pressed. For example, I've seen some designs where people create buttons, they use poor naming convention, and it's quite difficult to understand what button is actually doing. Now, if you want to be helpful and you want to tell people precisely what your button is doing, I recommend you use a hint option. Now, there is another option called tip, and you can take a look at the source code and how it's used, but I prefer to use hint because it's very, very simple to use. Let's take a look what this hint is doing. The hint is visible when you hover over the button, just pause your mouse over the element. Now, red button hint, use this to offer explanation what the button is about to do. So this is going to be my hint. You can write whatever you want here. You can even include HTML and not HTML. You can include hyperlinks here and take people to some other pages inside Creatio or perhaps somewhere else on the web where you maintain your persistent documentation. But nonetheless, This simple property can do wonders, especially for new users who are not aware of the functionality that you're implementing. So, okay, perfect. So now we have a hint, now we have a caption. We know how to specify them. The next thing is the tag. Now, the tag itself, you may not need to use the tag and your function will work perfectly fine. However, when you use a tag in combination with click, you're simply offering your method, and the method that I'm going to be calling here called onMyButtonClick, an additional way to discern which button is being pressed. So imagine that you have one method that handles all your buttons, or perhaps 3 or 4 buttons on the page, and then you somehow need to send a second parameter to find out which button was actually pressed. And this will become a lot more apparent once we take a look at the sub-items. So let's take a look now at my sub-items. So we've defined the hint, we've defined the caption. Now we're going to go into sub-items. In order for you to create sub-items, you need to define property menu. And inside the property menu, you need to put an array of items, nothing else, just like this. So you've got a menu, and inside the menu, you put array of items. Every item will represent one sub-item. In here, similarly, we're defining property caption, we're defining property click, or essentially this is a handler, button handler. So when you're clicking the button, what's going to have to happen? We can specify whether or not it's visible. And the reason I'm showing you here whether or not visible is because visibility quite often will be controlled by a method. So perhaps if certain conditions are true on the page, you may want to make this button visible, otherwise it's invisible. There's also an option enabled. I didn't bother including it, but take a look at how enabled works, and that just basically grays this thing out rather than hiding it. I prefer to hide it so the user doesn't even know that it's available. I also provide some hints, just like I provide a hint here, and I provide a tag for my submenu item. I then repeat this element second time, with the only visible change here is that I am providing a different caption and a different tag name. Also note that here I am not using any localizable values. Whereas in the root button, I used my localizable values and I bothered to go inside and create a localizable string, which offers me an option to translate and support multiple languages for my button. The sub-items are not supported in the localizable strings right now. So it will always be sub-item 1 and sub-item 2. If I wanted to support localizable string for this caption, I would need to go and create this localizable caption and essentially copy this line of code and say, yes, go ahead and bind yourself to sub-item 1 caption of some sort, but I would need to go ahead and add it manually. I didn't want to spend time on this, so I didn't really do this. Let's take a look how this works. If we flip back to our page and we click on this little triangle, we'll see that you've got sub-item 1 and sub-item 2 showing up. Now, if I hover over sub-item 2, I get a hint for sub-item 2. So it's telling you it's a sub-item 2 hint. So as with the main button, you can provide some additional features or additional explanation as to what to expect when the button is clicked. And it seems to be very, very useful if the sub-item itself, like sub-item 2, is not explanatory enough. Okay, let's take a look now at what the method is. So if I click on my button, something needs to happen. In this case, it says button with the tag red clicked. If I click on sub-item 1, then I'm launching something else, and I'll show you what is it that I'm launching right now. Let's go ahead and take a look at how this onMyButtonClick works. Now, onMyButtonClick is just the name of a method that will be launched. Okay, so here's my method, and I've defined this method up on top inside my methods property. My method is very simple. It says, let me get a tag from the arguments that are going to be passed into my function, and all I'm going to do is, if the tag is defined, then let me just simply come here and report what is it that you're clicking. Now, if you want to debug this, you just use regular tools off your browser. And in this case, we can click F12, we can click Control P to search for the source. And let's say that we're going to be looking for contact page v2. Okay, so contact page v2 is where our source code lives. So we can put a breakpoint on this red button and see what happens when we click it. Now, somewhere down here, we will be able to find our method. We just have to look for it. So rather than looking, let me just grab this on my button click. Let me just search for this string. I don't spend time looking through 3,000 lines of code. And what I want to show you is what's happening when you're clicking the button. So let's just click red button. You click button and let's take a look at your arguments. You see that your argument, here's your argument, the third argument that's called red. And that's precisely the tag that we've passed. Here's the tag that we're passing. So we can use this tag or argument 3, right? We can use this argument to figure out if it's our button or some else. So imagine if you had a red button, a green button, and a blue button, and they all wanted to be handled by the same method, then using tag is quite easy for you to understand which button is clicked. Now let's take a look at what's happening when we're clicking on a submenu item. Now click on the submenu item, we're still inside this my button click. Now the reason we're still inside this method is because each submenu item also has its click event handler. In this case, they're all pointing to the same direction. However, the tag in this case is called subitem1. So let's take a look at the arguments now. You see now subitem2 is coming to me in the first argument, so in the argument with the array 0. So I have to work on my method to make sure that I'm reacting to either an argument 0 or argument 3. Now, usually what's going to happen is you're going to have a method for a button click and then maybe another handler for submenu item click. And if you don't want to use two methods, then you're going to have to figure out a logic how you're going to be checking either argument 3 or argument 0 for what your tag is. Now, in this case, because argument 3 does not exist, I am not getting any value in my tag, so I'm not showing a message. Okay, so it's a very simple method. Okay, let's take a look at other buttons that exist on this page. I'm going to refresh my page, and just believe me for now. Just go with me for now on this one. Why I'm doing this. Okay, and we're going to take a look at some other buttons that's showing up on the page. So as we load the button, you'll see that I have the red button, but I also have a green button. Let's take a look at the construction of my green button. If you expand everything, you'll see that it's quite easy to identify what the item is. Now, the item itself is configured in exactly the same way as the previous button, as the red button, with the exception of a couple of properties that I had to add in order to position it and align it properly in the top bar. So first, the name. The primary contact button green, that has to be a specific name. So the name that we used before, we cannot recycle. We have to give it a unique name. Now, who's my parent? Now, in this case, my parent is going to be a left container, which is responsible for the area right here. Okay, so that's going to be my part. Okay, good. So we're still specifying that it's a button. We're specifying that it's green, but then these classes, that's something new. Now, these classes, they're responsible for this little gap that you can see between the buttons, and this is also a button. And if we hover over, you'll be able to see that there's also a gap here. So if you want to get this gap, you have to make sure that you have a wrapper class. And the wrapper class is responsible for applying certain CSS styles so that your button looks nice. Now you can find all these classes just by simply examining our source code or reading documentation, but I've already done this work, so you might as well just copy it. Now when you use this actions button margin right, it will put nice margin and all these buttons will look very uniform and like it was meant to be there. Now the rest of the stuff is exactly the same. We have the tag, we have the menu. Inside the menu we have a couple of items, and inside these items we define caption, click, whether or not it's visible, hint, excuse me, and a tag itself. So when I'm going on my green button and I'm hovering over my subitem 1, I'm also getting a subitem 1 hint. There's nothing new here. All these items can also be connected to a localizable string, so you can easily support multiple languages if that's what you want to do. When pressing a button, the logic works in exactly the same way. I can press the button and I get inside the same method. I can execute this method and everything works perfectly fine. If I click on a subitem And again, if you look at the argument, you'll see that the tag is coming in the zeroth, in the first element or array with the index 0. And so we need to work on this method to make sure that we properly react into our tag. Now, the reason I'm providing a blue button and a transparent button is just to show you various design options that are available at your disposal. A blue button, the only difference between a blue button and a green button is this one word. If I were to change this green to blue or red, then my button would change color. It's very easy to do. If you want to create your own custom colors, then you either need to provide a CSS class that will color it a certain way, or you need to override controls, and that's not something that I want to get involved in right now. It's quite a lot of work, so I don't want to be doing it. So we're going to stick with the colors that are available to us by default: blue, red, green, transparent, and there is one for gray. The other buttons are just demonstrating that you've got a blue color, you've got a gray color, everything else stays the same. All right, let's take a look now at actions. Okay, so now that we've looked at the buttons and we understand how buttons work, let's take a look now at actions. Now, actions is the collection of items that is available to you right here. So I've added 3 items here. It may not look like I've added 3 items, but I actually have added 3 items here. First item that I've added is this page action item 1. The second item is page action item 2. And the third item is this separator between updates with social network data and my own or items of my own design. Now, it's important to put separators so that you can separate a logical items in some sort of a block, and that's just a good design pattern. So I wanted to add that, and that's why I've added 3 items. Now let's take a look how we're adding separators. Turns out that we're no longer defining a div. We are now defining something inside the method, and we're doing that because these submenus and menus, they're actually just methods. And anyway, just go with me on that one. Okay, so we have to define methods, not a div. So we're not drawing an element, we're adding a menu item, right? So it's not really an element. It's kind of like an element of already existing element that we're overriding. In any event, in order for you to do that, we need to override this method called getActions. Now, this method originally defined in base page v2, and there is this getAction method. So if you're interested to see what's actually happening and how things are being added and which properties are being used, feel free to review base page v2 and find getActions there. Now, in my example, all I want to do is I want to add a couple of items. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say, okay, well, if it's defined in the parent, then I probably need to call parent somehow. And it turns out that if I call parent with argument, in return, I'm going to get this action menu items. This is exactly the item that represents the collection of items that is available in here. So it's this container. Okay, so the first thing that I want to do is I want to add my menu separator. I add my menu separator on line 32, and that just simply offers me this straight line. We don't need to offer, we don't have a control over thickness of the line or color of the line. We're just simply adding a line. So this line adds this little line. It's nicely CSS'd, so it doesn't go all the way to the edge. So anyway, it looks like it was done by the manufacturer. It looks like it was done by people who developed the product themselves. Okay, so now that I've added my separator, the next thing that I want to add is start adding my action items. So on line 33 and on line 40, you'll see an example of how to add those items. I'm specifying a caption, a click property, whether or not it's enabled. I'm specifying a tag, and for one item, I'm also specifying image config. An image config is an option for me to decorate this image item with a picture. You'll see this picture right here. This red square is represented by an image that is stored in localizable resources called Creatio square. So it's very easy for you to add an image. If you just simply take this line and add it somewhere, let's say here, but change this to Creatio triangle and obviously upload that image, then you'll have multiple images. Now, there are some constraints to what size of the image needs to be, and in my case, I figured that an image of 20 by 20 works perfectly fine. So I'm going to go with that. All right. Let's take a look now at how I upload my images. If I come back to my schema here, and rather than go into localizable strings, I can go to localizable images. Let's collapse localizable strings, and you'll see that there is an option for images. If you expand your images, you'll see that some images are available to me, and somewhere here we'll now find Creatio Square. You can click on the Creatio Square, click on the pencil box, and you'll get some information about it. The most important one is going to be the code and the ID itself. We'll use this ID to later bind this image to our package so that when you're installing it, or when you're installing it after cloning it from GitHub, everything is included. So I'll use it in data binding later. Okay, so now I've got my image, I've got my actions, and I've got my buttons. Life is good. Let's move on to, and let's take a look at what's happening when I am inside my section. So let's review some buttons that we're going to be working with on the section. So on the section, in the same way as we did with buttons, we have actions, and then we have the option to put buttons here. In my actions, if I click on them, I have created section action 1, section action 2. Now, section action 1, section action 2, they're added in exactly the same way as we did it on the page. So let me show you how I did it. So for that, we're going to flip to a file called contact section v2, and inside this section, we're going to review this get section actions. Now, if you're paying attention, you might notice that on the contact page, in order for us to get actions, we get actions, whereas if we want to do it on the section page, we need to get section action. So a lot of people fall for this mistake, and they just simply think, okay, well, it's the same thing, or they remember that the configuration is very simple, and they provide a method just like this. This will not work. Only this will work. Just like in the previous example, I am adding a separator or a menu separator to my item, and then I'm populating it with couple of properties here. Okay. So that's my section. Let's take a look at my section. There we go. All right. Now, the next thing is I'm adding a second item, but in here I'm doing something a little bit different. Pay attention to line number 96. In line number 96, I'm including sub-items into my item. So in line number 96, I want to include these two sub-items. How do I do that? Well, it turns out that all I need to do is I need to provide a collection of items, right? So I need to provide a collection of these menu items. So how do I get a collection of menu items? I bind it to a method that returns a collection. Here's the method, add sub-items. It's defined immediately below it. Let's go inside the sub-items. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to define a generic Terasoft collection. So there we go. We've got our collection. And now in the collection, add item, I'm adding an item. So I'm adding an item for button menu item. So just like we created the button menu item here, I'm adding a collection here. So nothing different. It just, I find this structure simpler. And it's nicely separated, so I don't have to create this method to be, this method doesn't have to be too long. I mean, you could have inlined everything, but I think this, my approach is a little bit nicer this way. Okay, so I've created a collection item 1. I've created a collection item number 2. I've provided the same properties such as tags, clicks, and captions. And again, you can bind it to localizable strings. That's perfectly fine. And I'm just simply returning this collection. So essentially, what this method is doing, it's creating a collection. It says, okay, well, you've got this collection, and might as well be a JSON file of some sort, and then you're going to put it inside the items. So now your section is enriched with these drop-down menus, just like it was done originally by someone in Exchange package. Here, we're doing it on our own. Submenu item 1, and if I click it, I can get my menu. I'm not providing any text here, as I didn't think it was necessary, but in this case, on action, click, I have a method, and as you could tell, it's not specifying anything. So can I get my tags? Can I get my arguments? Well, let's find out. Let's open our contact section, and inside of our contact section, let's look for this method on action click or show menu item. Let's put a breakpoint, and let's just simply call this method and see what's coming here. Now, what I want to see is what's coming to me in the arguments. Okay, and I see that, oops, I've got some arguments, and you could tell that in the arg0, you can still get your sub2. So the arguments are still there. You can still see them. The 0th item, just like before, offers you access to the tag that you want to differentiate. So if you have one method that handles the interaction of all these buttons, then it's not really difficult. If you just click on this item, on section action item 2 rather than sub item, okay? So if you click here, same way, you can get access to your arguments. So let's take a look what my arguments are now. And in this case, my argument is going to be item 2. Okay, so in this case, it's going to be a name of a button. In any event, it's important that you know what you're catching or how you're going to catch it, and you can handle all your buttons and all your clicks quite easily. All right. Now, the next thing that I want to talk to you about is probably the most confusing part, and that has to do with how we place these buttons. And why do I see section ABC here, and why, when I'm going from the section to, and I'm opening the card, why am I seeing these buttons and not the buttons that I saw before? For reference, what I'm going to do is I'm going to offer you this. I'm going to open this page directly. Let me close all this stuff, we don't need it. So let me open the page directly by navigating to the URL. Okay, so there's my URL, and you can see that I've got a green button, a blue button, and a page button. But when I'm going to my page from the section, I'm seeing a red button and a green button, totally different names, and I named them as such just so that it's becoming quite obvious to you which button you're looking at. Now, it turns out that when you're navigating to a section by just going to appropriate section in your workplace, so we're going to go into a contact, what you're actually loading is you're loading a contact section v2. In here, when you're opening the record, it's the contact section v2 is kind of in chain, right? It's loading a page. So this area right now, the stop area, is actually still managed by the section page. And a visual clue that is available to you is this little triangle. If you click on this little triangle, you'll see that the entire section opens up and you see all your records that are available in the system. Now also take a look at what's happening to the section ABC button. Section ABC button jumps, so it stays here. So that's the name of the container we'll take a look at. So it can be either here, or with the trick of CSS, it can be positioned here. The red button, though, it stays consistent in this spot. Now, why do you need to know about it? Well, you need to know about it, first of all, when you click on the new contact. If you were to click on the new contact without a mini page, okay, you would see that not the section buttons are shown to you, but the buttons from defined on the page are shown to you. And you just simply want to provide user with a consistent experience. So if you want to make sure that the buttons are available when you navigate from a section, or if you come to a contact directly by following the link, you want to make sure that the buttons are the same. So we need to find a way to unite them. Well, one such way is to mimic a similar button. So in here, I said that I've got a section comb and section ABC. Now, if I were to name this button with a similar caption as I named it here, and I painted them the same color, you wouldn't know the difference. So as the user, you wouldn't be able to tell the difference. As a developer, you would know, okay, well, one is the section button, one is the page button. So let's take a look how and where you can position these buttons in code. So in code, when you're working with the section, the buttons are a little bit trickier, and I'll explain why in just a minute. Let's take a look at some of these buttons. And this is my very useful description here. So the first thing, let's take a look at our red button. And again, let's remind ourselves the behavior of the red button. So the red button stays here regardless of what you're doing. So the red button doesn't move. So the red button goes in combined mode actions button card left container. So it's a mouthful. That's why I called it ABC, combine action button container, right? So that's why I believe I called it ABC. Where's my caption? Yes, combine. Sorry, I called it combine. Just to kind of understand which container it goes in. Okay. In terms of configuration of my button, everything stays the same. Familiar items need to be defined, so things like property name, the name of the button, the type that it's the button, its design, so basically color. The same classes that we define on the page need to be specified. So in this case, I'm specifying a text class and a wrapper class. I'm providing a caption, and I'm specifying what happens when I click on this button. I'm also specifying a tag for this button. In this case, I just simply took a name of the container. Tag can obviously be whatever it is that you want it to be. Okay, so this is one way, and this is the container now. Now we know that this container doesn't jump. It stays there at all times. Now, what about this other container, the container that jumps? Now, the container that jumps is this action buttons container. And in this case, it's a green one. So let's remind ourselves what the behavior is. Here's my behavior. Okay, so my button jumps onto the section. Okay, so this is my green button. And the green button, everything stays the same about the button except for, obviously, its color and the tag and the container. So the most important thing is the container, or this fella, right? No, where's my container? Caption, click, parent. Where's my parent? Right, actions, but action buttons container. Okay, so everything else stays the same. It's just the container and the color that is different. Okay, so we've got the button, we understand the behavior, and I'm not saying which one to use and which one not to use. I just wanted to show you that you've got multiple behaviors, and for each button you can choose which one you go with. Okay, so now how do I handle these buttons? So if we were to look on the contact page v2, when we clicked on the action, right, so on my button click, I can refer to any property that is loaded to me on the page by just simply saying something like, let's say var ID is equal to what? Var ID is equal to this dot $ID. So this way I will be able to get a property of my contact's ID. Now, if I wanted to get another property, for example, email or a property name, I would just simply do something like this. Okay, so I would say name, and here I would say email. Okay, perfect. So it's nice and easy. And once I have that information, maybe I want to save it somewhere or do something. In any event, I can have access to my entire contact. Now, when we're working with section, things are slightly different. When you're clicking on the button, you're not working within the model of one particular or view model of one particular contact. You're working with the entire grid. So if you ever designed your own UI, you've got a table of rows, right? So a collection of records versus working within one record. And so we cannot just come on the section and say, hey, section, give me a record. No, 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 it's not going to work because section works with the grid or many records. So let's take a look how we can get access to our record or the record that is selected. We don't need that, but let me find my methods wherever they are. Okay. So in my method, on button click, okay, on section button click, here's what I want to show you. So we're still getting our tags and everything works as expected, but in order for me to get access to my currently selected or currently highlighted record, whether or not it's just selected or if it's, or I actually open the card for it, is to operate with these notions of grid data and active row. Now, grid data is always going to be there, so technically I don't need to check for whether or not grid data is defined, but I've decided to put it here regardless. Now, active row is only going to have a value when you select the row. Let me demonstrate you that. So let's come back here. Let's get out, get back in. And what I want to do is I want to click on this section ABC. Now, before I do that, though, let me click on, let me find contact section V2. And in contact section V2, I want to find this method of mine, right? So I want to put a breakpoint here. So let me click on this section button, and as expected, I'm inside my method. But look at this, none of my records are currently selected. I haven't selected any record. So if I'm going to go into this grid data, I'm getting some values. However, if I look at active row, there's absolutely nothing there. So I have no idea which section you've selected. So if you want to perform an action for the entire set of contacts, it's perfectly feasible, and this is probably a good place for you to put a button. So for example, you may want to run a procedure to synchronize all your contacts, or maybe you want to exchange some data with your ERP system or whatnot. So it's perfectly fine to add a button here. If on the other hand, though, like you've decided to select a record, just like that, and now you click on this button, then this Get Active Row is actually available, and it's going to provide us ID of the record. So this is a unique identifier of the record itself. The next thing that I want to do is I want to go inside this method. So let's just go inside this method. And let's say that we would like from grid data execute get on this property, on this ID essentially, and I want to get all my columns. So here's my columns object that enumerates or lists essentially all the properties that are available to me, and I can just convert it into a collection if I really needed to, and then I can access my properties this way. So now my name and my email, right? So here's my name, go away. Here's my name, in this case, is Alexander Wilson. And if we move on, then the email is also going to be available to us. So it's picking up from the grid. Now, when you're reading items from the page, the difference is quite obvious. On the page, you just simply say, okay, I've got this guy and this ID or this email or this name, and it's nice and easy for you. You can read it and you can start operating here. However, when you are in section, you have to go through this gymnastics. You have to say grid data, get active row, and then specify the property of the active row that you would like to get. Now, if you find yourself in a position or in a situation where perhaps the properties aren't defined here, then what you may want to do, you want to enforce them, or you want to always include them. For that, we have properties such as an attribute for list config, and just make sure that you just search for it in the source code, and you will be able to see how we can use list config to include some additional properties here. Now, the reason you want to include it, imagine your button somehow relies not on the ID that is guaranteed to be there, but perhaps on the email or maybe a telephone number. So if you change your, we had 9 columns here. So if we go here and we say, okay, let's select fields to display, okay? And I'm going to go into my list view and I'm just going to remove them all, okay? I'm just going to leave contact name just like that, nothing else. And what's going to happen now, even though I select my Jane Smith and I still click on my button, now let's just walk through this method. Okay, and let's just see, oops. Uh-oh. Missed the button on the keyboard. Let's try it again. Okay, so let's take a look at all these objects that are available. Now you can see that we only have 8. Right? So some items are removed, some items are permanently there, but some items are removed. And as you add items or as you remove items, it will become part of your collection. So you cannot just simply rely on the properties to be there, because as user configures these columns, these items may or may not be there. So the best way for you to act upon the situation is to probably rely on an ID. And then, knowing an ID, you can always execute entity schema query to query your contact, or perhaps you can enforce that the email item is always loaded into your grid. So this is going to be the way that you want to handle it. Now, the other couple of recommendations that I may give you is you probably want to keep same code or items or methods that are executing the same thing kind of combined. So you don't want to create some method handlers on section, some methods on page. Perhaps you may want to investigate mix-ins and whether or not you can architect your methods and your solution in such a way that you can define most of your logic in one place. Mix-in is a great place for it. Perhaps you may want to rely on IDs rather than values, especially if you find yourself in a localizable environment, so environment with multiple languages to support. That's also not a good option for you to go by a literal value. So those are just some basic examples that basic hygiene items that you may want to think of when you're writing code here in JS. All right, what else can we talk about buttons? All of our buttons, so if we go inside the context, our buttons, they can be positioned anywhere you want. Button can be positioned inside any of the containers, so as long as you find a container, you can put it there as kind of an exercise for yourself. See if you can take this button, okay, see if you can this button, and see if you can just simply move it underneath this email. So if you can just add it there. It's a fairly easy exercise, but it will show you an idea how you can define a button, how you can move it to different containers. Buttons can be tiny, especially if you're not specifying any text there, then button is going to be quite small. You can put some images on the button. You saw me do it with the image config. So the sky is the limit. The best way to search for how the buttons are being used is probably by searching for or source code for items that configuring the buttons. So let's just open some div and let's say that we would like to search for this button and see if we can discover some other menus or some other properties that can be defined on the button. So let's do Control-Shift-F so we can search for it, and let's search for this button. Visual Studio is quite nice to us, and it's going to give us all the examples where the button is being used, and we're going to find quite a lot here. I have a full bundle, so I expect to find quite a lot of options, so let it index them. And then you can just simply go through all these buttons and take a look how the buttons are being configured in some other pages. So for example, Business Rules, Schema Designer, they're defining a button this way. And on some other pages, we can just quickly take a look how they're designing buttons, and maybe you'll find some interesting properties here. Okay, so I don't expect to find anything interesting here, but you've got things like marker values. They're also quite interesting. You've got some menu configs if you want to configure your menu in a particular class with the UIs. So there's some other options that are available to you. I can't possibly discuss them all, as there are quite a few. But if you see a good example, just find where this example is implemented. Go ahead and take a look how it's done. And this is by far the best way to learn about Creatio rather than trying to find it inside documentation. All right, that's probably all I had for us today. So like I said, the code will be published on GitHub, and I will post a link in the description for this video below. And that's it, guys. So thank you very much for coming. And if you're watching this in the recording, thank you for your time. And next week, we've got something special with Lena prepared for you. So please do join us next week, and looking forward to seeing you there. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.